In a classroom where equations seem to hold more value than voices, a young woman with deep roots and a brilliant mind dares to question the boundaries. When science and identity collide, true genius isn't measured in grades, but in resilience. The Grand Hall of the National Autonomous University of Arizona seemed to have its own gravity when Sofia Ramirez crossed the threshold for the first time. It wasn't just the historic building with its limestone columns and murals depicting America's scientific history, but the invisible density of expectations floating in the air. The seats were already occupied by students who had grown up in private schools in Santa Fe, New York City, or Boston. Young people who carried not only the latest calculators, but also the light weight of never having doubted their right to be there. Sofia, on the other hand, carried with her the echo of Pine Ridge, her community on the outskirts of Tucson, a place where the only library functioned 3 days a week in the community center, and where the silence necessary for studying was a scarce privilege. Her light brown skin and her Native American features, inherited from her grandmother, Mrs. Agnes, stood out among the other students. Her black hair, meticulously braided every Sunday by her grandmother, while telling her stories of wise women who read the stars long before telescopes existed, fell over her shoulders like a silent declaration of identity. Professor Alexander Douglas, head of advanced quantum physics, entered the room with the authority accumulated over 30 years of teaching and 3 National Science Awards. A tall man with graying hair, fine-framed glasses, and a voice that never needed to be raised to be heard. His reputation preceded him, brilliant, demanding, and traditional to the core. Welcome to the course that will determine if you're made for true theoretical physics or if you should consider another, more accessible specialty, he said, making a deliberate pause while his eyes scanned the room. There is no place for mediocrity in quantum physics. From the first day, Sofia noticed the difference in treatment. When she raised her hand, Professor Douglas seemed not to see her, or worse, saw her and decided to ignore her. When he finally gave her the floor, he often interrupted her before she could fully articulate her reasoning. "Let's get to the point, Miss Ramirez. Time in physics is valuable. We cannot disperse ourselves in ramblings," he told her on one occasion, while dedicating 15 minutes to listening to and analyzing the theory of Matthew Velasquez, son of a renowned professor from MIT. Days turned into weeks, and the weeks into a painfully clear pattern. It wasn't just the professor's attitude. It was also the looks from some classmates, conversations that stopped when she approached, study groups that formed without inviting her. One afternoon, during the explanation of a particularly complex problem about quantum superposition, Sofia saw something that others didn't notice: an alternative approach, an application of Bell's theorem that could simplify the solution. She took a deep breath, feeling her heart racing, and raised her hand. "Professor, I think we could apply a variant of Bell's theorem, considering that the particles maintain a non-local correlation even when—" Professor Douglas looked at her, over his glasses, and let out a brief, dry laugh. "Miss Ramirez, we are doing rigorous physics here, not folkloric interpretations. Let's leave poetry for literature classes, shall we?" The contained laughter of several students felt like needles in her skin, but more painful was the complicit silence of those who didn't laugh. Sofia slowly lowered her hand, feeling the heat in her cheeks and a knot in her throat. She didn't say anything else for the rest of the class, not because she had nothing to say, but because she was calculating, measuring, preparing. That evening, returning to the small room she rented near the university, she didn't turn on the television as she usually did to accompany her loneliness. The space was austere but hers: a single bed, a wooden desk rescued from the street and repaired by herself, a chair, and on the wall, the only luxury, a framed photograph of her grandmother, Agnes, holding her high school diploma, the first woman in her family to finish it at the age of 53. Sofia took out her old laptop, a community gift when she was accepted to the university. It was slow, sometimes overheated, but that night it would be enough. She worked until dawn painted the white walls of her room orange. She didn't sleep, she didn't eat. She only calculated, reviewed, checked, and calculated again. At 6:43 in the morning, she sent an email to Professor Douglas. The subject simply said, "Alternative application of Bell's theorem in multiple particle systems." She attached a 24-page PDF document with mathematical demonstrations, bibliographical references, and examples of practical application. She signed it with her full name, Sofia Ramirez Hernandez. 3 days later, while checking her email in the library, she found the response, "Document received. We will discuss in the next session." Sofia didn't know how to interpret such a terse response. Her stomach tensed at the possibility of a more elaborate public humiliation, but she had already crossed the threshold. There was no turning back. The following Thursday, Professor Douglas entered the classroom with his usual authoritative presence, but this time he brought with him a USB drive that he connected to the projector. Expectant silence filled the space as the screen lit up. "Before continuing with the program, I want to show you an interesting analysis that arrived in my email," he announced in a neutral voice. "It's an unconventional but mathematically rigorous approach to the problem we discussed last week." For 40 minutes, the professor guided the class through the document. He explained each equation, each diagram, without mentioning the author. At one point, he stopped at a particularly elegant formula and looked at the class. This is precisely the beauty of theoretical physics, when someone sees beyond the evident. From her place in the third row, Sofia held her breath. Her hands gripped the edge of her notebook so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. The professor kept talking, but she no longer heard the words. She only saw her equations, her ideas, projected before everyone. It was then that Eleanor Foster, one of the brightest students in the group, raised her hand. "Professor, this work is really surprising. Can we know who developed it?" The silence that followed seemed eternal. Professor Douglas adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat slightly. "In fact, the author is present in this classroom." All faces began to turn, looking among the usual. Students, those who always participated, who always stood out. Matthew Velasquez even smiled slightly, anticipating the recognition. "Miss Ramirez," the professor finally said, directing his gaze toward her, "would you like to explain your reasoning behind the third derivation?" The silence that followed was dense, almost tangible. Dozens of gazes converged on her like laser beams, some incredulous, others confused, some frankly hostile. Sofia stood up slowly, with trembling legs but a firm voice. "The key point is to consider that quantum non-locality can extend to multiple particle systems if we apply a logarithmic transformation to the original operator," she began. And as she spoke, her voice gained solidity. "This allows us to visualize correlations that remained hidden under the traditional model." For 10 minutes, Sofia spoke with the authority of someone who has spent entire nights dialoguing with equations, as if they were living beings. The professor listened attentively, occasionally nodding, asking precise questions that she answered without hesitation. When she finished, she expected some mocking comment, some dismissive refutation, but what she received was a brief nod from the professor. "Very well. This demonstrates that appearances can be deceiving, in physics and also outside of it," he said, before continuing with the scheduled class. That afternoon, upon leaving the classroom, Sofia felt that something had changed. It wasn't a dramatic or immediate change. Nobody ran to congratulate her or ask her to join their study group. But the eyes that had previously ignored her now observed her with a new caution, as if they had suddenly discovered that the furniture that had been in the room for months could speak. In the following days, she noticed a subtle change in the classroom dynamics. Professor Douglas began to call on her more often, but his questions became more incisive, more challenging. He no longer ignored her. Now he constantly tested her, as if trying to figure out if that work had been a stroke of luck or the product of a truly brilliant mind. "Miss Ramirez, since you have so much interest in unconventional approaches, perhaps you can enlighten us on the EPR paradox before the next class," he told her one day, assigning her a topic normally reserved for doctoral students. Sofia said nothing, but her eyes held the professor's gaze without blinking. A new battle had begun. One afternoon, after another particularly intense class, Dr. Carmen West, the coordinator of the physics department, intercepted her in the hallway. "Miss Ramirez, do you have a moment?" Dr. West, a woman in her 50s with black hair streaked with grey and a serene but powerful presence, led her to her office. It was an orderly space but full of life, books stacked on shelves reaching the ceiling, photographs of scientific expeditions, a blackboard covered with equations. "I've been observing your performance and I've also reviewed your work on Bell's theorem," she said without preamble. "It's exceptional." Sophia felt a knot in her throat. She wasn't used to direct praise. "Thank you, Doctor. Professor Douglas is a brilliant scientist, but he belongs to a generation where women, especially those of Native American origin, were not considered suitable for theoretical physics," continued the doctor. "That doesn't justify his behavior, it just contextualizes it." She paused, as if carefully considering her next words. "We're starting a research project in collaboration with the Max Planck Institute in Germany. We need fresh minds, different perspectives. I'd like you to consider joining as a research assistant." Sophia blinked, unsure if she had heard correctly. "Me? But I'm only in my second year. Einstein published his most revolutionary works when he was just a patent office employee," smiled the doctor. "Age and title don't define talent." That night, Sophia called her grandmother Agnes from the public phone near her room. Phone calls were a luxury she allowed herself only on special occasions. "Grandma, they offered me a position in a research project," she said, her voice trembling slightly with excitement. On the other end of the line, the silence was followed by a long, deep sigh. "My child, when you were born, your father wanted a son to help him in the field," said Mrs. Agnes in a measured voice. "But I saw your eyes, the way you looked at the world from the crib, and I told him, this girl didn't come to plant corn. She came to plant ideas." Sophia laughed softly, with tears forming in her eyes. "I miss you, Grandma. And I miss you, my Sophia. But the most beautiful flowers grow far from the garden where they were born." Over the next few months, Sophia divided her time between regular classes and the quantum physics laboratory, where the project was taking shape. Under the direction of Dr. Klaus Miller, an internationally renowned German physicist, and Dr. West, the team worked on an algorithm to simulate the behavior of subatomic particles under extreme conditions. "Your mathematical intuition is remarkable, Doctor," Miller told her one day, after she identified a subtle error in a series of equations that had been giving inconsistent results. "You have a way of seeing connections that others overlook." But it wasn't all recognition and progress. In the classroom, Professor Douglas had intensified his scrutiny. He now reviewed each of her assignments with relentless thoroughness, pointing out the slightest error or imprecision with barely disguised pleasure. "Miss Ramirez, this development is interesting, but it lacks rigor in the third step," he announced, one day returning her exam with a barely passing grade. "Intuition without precision is like an airplane without wings. It might be beautiful, but it doesn't fly." Sophia received the paper without her face revealing the inner turmoil. She had spent the entire night working on that exam, verifying each step. She knew her answer was correct, but she also knew that arguing at that moment would only reinforce the narrative that she was too emotional, too insecure for theoretical physics. Instead, she put the exam in her backpack and that afternoon took it to Dr. Miller, not to complain but to understand. "There is indeed an error, but it's not yours," said the German physicist after reviewing the work. "The professor's criticism is based on an orthodox interpretation of quantum mechanics that has already been questioned in recent literature." He showed her several articles published in the last 2 years that supported the approach she had used. "Physics is living knowledge, always evolving. Some professors get trapped in the historical moment of their own education." That semester was a constant balance between the emotional drain of classes with Professor Douglas and the intellectual stimulation of the laboratory. Sophia began to publish as a co-author in scientific articles, first in national journals and then in a prestigious international publication. It was in April when Dr. Miller spoke to her about the Max Planck Institute Scholarship Program. Each year we select 3 students from around the world for a 6-month research stay in Munich, he explained. I think you should apply. But the competition must be enormous, Sophia replied, and my English isn't as good as. Your English is perfectly functional, and your mathematics speak a universal language, Doctor, Miller interrupted. Besides, you've already contributed significantly to our current research. It wouldn't be a favor, but a deserved recognition. Sophia spent weeks preparing her application, polishing her motivation essay, collecting letters of recommendation. Dr. West provided an enthusiastic evaluation, and Dr. Miller did the same. Only a 3rd letter was missing, ideally from a department professor who could speak about her academic performance. With her heart beating strongly, she knocked on the door of Professor Douglas's office. Come in, the familiar voice responded. The professor looked up from the papers he was grading, and his expression hardened slightly when he saw her. Miss Ramirez, how can I help you? Professor, I'm applying for a research scholarship at the Max Planck Institute, and I need a letter of recommendation from a department professor who knows my academic work, she explained, trying to make her voice sound professional and confident. The Max Planck Institute has exceptionally high standards, he replied, taking off his glasses and placing them on the desk. They don't usually accept undergraduate students without a proven record of sustained excellence. Sophia took a deep breath. I understand, Professor. That's why I'd like the letter to reflect your honest assessment of my abilities and limitations. If you think I'm not a suitable candidate, I'd prefer to know now. The professor observed her for a long time, as if trying to solve a new type of equation. I'll leave the letter in your mailbox on Friday, he finally said. I can't promise it will be what you expect. I only ask for honesty, Professor. Thank you for your time. Leaving the office, Sophia didn't know if she had just made a strategic error or taken a necessary step. But it was already done. On Friday, she found a sealed envelope in her mailbox. She opened it with trembling fingers, expecting the worst. The letter, written in impeccable English, began formally, detailing the academic context in which he had known the student. Then, to her surprise, it continued. Miss Ramirez has demonstrated an exceptional ability to address complex problems from unconventional but mathematically sound perspectives. Her work on alternative applications of Bell's theorem revealed a deep understanding that is rarely observed in students at her level. While her style of reasoning does not always follow traditional paths, this should be considered a strength rather than a limitation. Theoretical physics advances precisely when young minds question established paradigms. I recommend Miss Ramirez without reservations for this opportunity, with the certainty that her contribution to the Institute will be as singular as it is valuable. Professor Douglas's signature at the end of the document seemed as rigid and formal as ever, but the words that preceded it had changed something fundamental. 3 months later, Sophia received notification that she had been selected for the scholarship. She was the first American student of Native American origin in the history of the program to achieve this. The news spread quickly through the department. Some professors congratulated her effusively. Other students asked her for details about the application process. Professor Douglas, on the other hand, simply announced at the end of a class, "I'm informed that Miss Ramirez has been selected for the Max Planck Institute research program. I suppose we'll have to find someone else for the final exam." There were no personal congratulations, no direct acknowledgement, but there was also no condescension or doubt in his tone. The last week before her departure, a small group of lab colleagues organized a modest farewell. Dr. West attended, as did Dr. Miller, who would fly with her to Germany to personally introduce her to the research team. To everyone's surprise, Professor Douglas briefly appeared with a small package wrapped in simple paper. "A small gift for your journey, Miss Ramirez," he said, handing her the package and leaving before she could open it. Inside was an old book, Isaac Newton's Principia Mathematica, a rare edition in Latin. On the first page, a brief inscription written in black ink. "To remember that great advances in physics always begin with someone who sees what others do not see." A.D. During the small celebration, Dr. West raised her glass and quoted a pioneering American physicist who had worked at CERN decades ago. May yesterday's silence be tomorrow's thunder. May each closed door be a new path to discover. Everyone drank, and at that moment Sophia felt that something was simultaneously closing and opening. One cycle was ending, another beginning. 3 days later, as the plane took off from Boston's airport, Sophia looked out the window as her country grew smaller and smaller. She thought of her grandmother Agnes, who had never been on a plane but who had taught her to fly with her mind since childhood. She thought of the nights studying, with a flashlight under the blankets so as not to wake her siblings. She thought of all the times she had doubted, that she had thought about giving up. And she also thought about that first day in the grand hall when it seemed that she belonged to a different universe than her classmates. Now she understood that it really was like that. She saw a different universe, with dimensions and possibilities that others couldn't even imagine. As the clouds enveloped the plane, Sophia took a new notebook from her backpack. On the first page she wrote a single equation. It wasn't about quantum physics or advanced mathematics. It was much simpler and at the same time infinitely more complex. Me, my roots, X, my wings, fear. We hope this story of intellectual courage, Native American heritage and personal overcoming has resonated with you. If you want to discover more tales where knowledge becomes an act of rebellion and self-love, visit our special playlist. You can find it here to the left of the video. Do you think science can also be a form of social justice? Or that each brilliant mind needs first to believe in its own light? Share your thoughts in the comments. Until the next story that unites roots and revolution.